Get out! You don't belong in this room. That's what the CEO shouted in front of the entire board, his finger pointed like a weapon across the polished oak table. His voice echoed against the marble walls. But what he didn't know, that woman he just humiliated would own the entire company by tomorrow. Before we dive in, what country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if you believe in justice, dignity, and full-circle revenge, hit that subscribe button, because the next story might be your own. Her name was Jordan Miles, a 39-year-old black financial strategist from Atlanta. She'd worked her way from a single mother of two to one of the most respected minds in private equity. But in that boardroom, they didn't see brilliance. They didn't see her credentials, her legacy, or the 10 million she'd just invested. All they saw was someone they thought didn't belong. But what they failed to understand, what would come crashing down on them within 24 hours, was that Jordan never let disrespect slide quietly. She turned every slap into leverage, every no into ownership. And this time, she had come prepared. Jordan Miles had woken up at 4:30 a.m., like she had every morning for the past 15 years. Not because she needed to, but because discipline had become her weapon. Years of raising two children on her own, while navigating a corporate world that rarely gave second chances, had carved her into a woman who didn't flinch at disrespect. She studied it, stored it, and used it to build empires. That day, she wore her finest gray tailored suit, not just to make an impression, but to armor herself for a meeting she knew would test her limits. She had been invited to sit in on a potential acquisition deal with Weston Ames, an aging investment firm desperate for young capital but unwilling to cede old power. Jordan wasn't just bringing money to the table. She had a proposal, one that would revolutionize their outdated systems, open global markets, and inject 10 million in fresh equity. But what she didn't expect was how hostile the room would become the moment she opened her presentation. The moment she stepped into the boardroom, the mood shifted. Eyes darted. Phones were lifted. Coffee cups were lowered mid-sip. It was as though her presence disrupted something sacred. A silence fell as the CEO, Charles Whitman, a man known more for his temper than his leadership, leaned back in his leather chair and stared at her like she had entered the wrong floor. She was 10 minutes early. She had every right to be there. But before she could unpack her files, before her assistant could even pull out a chair, Charles stood up with a scowl carved into his face and shouted for her to leave. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't question her purpose. He didn't even look at her badge or the documents with her name printed in gold foil. He saw a black woman with confidence walk into a space reserved for the wealthy elite and reacted with reflexive disdain. Jordan froze not in fear, but in calculation. Every eye in the room was on her. Every breath was caught. Her assistant started to speak, but Jordan raised one hand slightly, signaling silence. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't beg for respect. She turned, walked out calmly, and got into her car. But her hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from weakness, from controlled fury. She had seen this before. At banks, at conferences, even in her own building. But never this blatantly. Never in a room where she was the biggest investor. That's what made this different. And that's what gave her leverage. She called her legal advisor within the hour. Not to sue, but to acquire. Because what they didn't know, what Charles would find out too late, was that Jordan Miles had been watching this company for months. She had already begun discussions with majority shareholders. And now, with the humiliation burned into her memory, she moved faster. She spent the rest of that day making calls. Quiet calls. To quiet people. People who had grown tired of Charles's leadership. People who respected Jordan's vision. People who had already wanted out but needed someone with conviction and capital. She met with them in restaurants, on rooftop lounges, over encrypted video chats. And by 3 a.m., she had enough commitments to take control. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She didn't celebrate. She drafted her terms, not just to acquire, but to restructure. She didn't want revenge. She wanted a revolution. One that would leave no room for arrogance or bias to lead billion-dollar decisions. And the next morning, she walked back into that building. This time, her heels echoed like a war drum across the marble. Her posture was straight, her gaze unshakable, and her legal team flanked her sides like guards. She didn't go to reception. She didn't ask for clearance. She walked straight into the boardroom, the same one she had been expelled from. And this time, the silence that followed her entrance was very different. Charles was there, same suit, same chair, but his confidence faltered the moment he saw her. Because this time, Jordan wasn't a guest. She wasn't a hopeful contributor. She was the majority stakeholder. She didn't wait for permission to speak. She laid the documents on the table, looked him in the eye, and informed every member present that Weston, Ames now belonged to Miles Capital Holdings. Every gasp was music. Every stunned expression was a silent apology. Charles tried to speak, but the legal papers were already being distributed. His name was no longer on the top of the organizational chart. His reign was over. And Jordan? She sat in the very chair he had stood from the day before, the same chair he'd tried to keep her from. The same one that now symbolized her power. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't raise her voice. She simply opened her laptop, connected to the screen, and began the presentation she never got to deliver. This time, no one interrupted. Over the following weeks, Jordan transformed the company. Outdated departments were replaced. Diversity training became mandatory, but more importantly, diversity in leadership became non-negotiable. She opened internship pipelines for marginalized communities. She created grant programs for single mothers. She removed barriers, exposed biases, and built bridges. Weston, Ames wasn't just revived, it was reborn, and the city watched. The business world watched. Young professionals who looked like her watched, and for the first time, many of them believed they belonged at the table too. Jordan never raised her voice. She raised standards. She didn't seek revenge. She created reform. What started as an insult became an institution of change. Because when you're told you don't belong, don't fight to fit in, fight to take ownership. If this story gave you chills, don't scroll past. Hit that subscribe button. Because the next story might just remind you that your power isn't in being invited to the table, it's in building your own. And trust me, you're going to want to hear what happens next.